Hi, Chris Good here. This is part 2 of our week 6 essentials video lecture, and this is on psychotherapeutic drugs. We're going to be talking about a disorder called schizophrenia. A lot of people misunderstand this term. It literally means split or shattered mind, but that is not to be confused at all with split personality, or what we used to call multiple personality disorder is now called dissociative identity disorder, at least in the last version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Nope. Bleuler was a scientist who came up with this word in 1911 to refer to Kraepelin's description of a disorder he called dementia praecox, and it's kind of an unfortunate name because I don't think it describes the disorder very well. Or doesn't translate well. It doesn't mean that your brain is split into two parts. It means that it is shattered, that the components of your mind are shattered into pieces that don't work or communicate with each other very, very well. It doesn't have anything to do with your personality. Interestingly, Bleuler also characterized autism back in 1911. Kraepelin, before him, was awesome. He was one of the first folks to promote the idea that mental disorders have this biological basis. He studied genetics. He knew that there was this genetic relationship between mental disorders, and their symptoms. And he worked with older people. His student was Alzheimer, who described the disorder that bears his name. And he noticed that, in this minority of folks who are lucky enough to attain advanced age, a few of them really exhibit some psychotic behavior. They get paranoid thinking, delusions, they don't recognize people. And he saw this, though, not just in old people, but in a small percentage of very young people, exhibited the similar symptoms of dementia, but prematurely. So he called this dementia praecox, or this premature dementia, and differentiated between that and manic depression, where people would get very, very depressed, but then they go on this upswing and they can exhibit some really bizarre behaviors when they're very, very up in the manic phase of their disorder. But it's different from the type of dementia that you see in these very young people, 18, 19, 20 years old. Okay. What are the symptoms of schizophrenia? Well, they're really divided into three different categories. We're going to talk about two of them here. They're positive symptoms and negative symptoms. The third category is disordered symptoms, disordered thinking. Positive symptoms aren't, thumbs up happy symptoms. They're things that are present that are not present in people without this disorder. So positive means they've got something extra, including hallucinations. Now, most often they're auditory, they're not visual hallucinations, but those auditory hallucinations can take on the sound of a voice, maybe a voice that is sort of commenting on the behavior of the person experiencing the hallucination. Sometimes it's critical of them, and it's not, it's not a happy sort of thing to endure. Positive symptoms may include delusions of grandeur, thinking that you're, at the center of some pivotal event or conspiracy. You might have delusions of persecution and paranoid thinking that somebody's, monitoring your thoughts or spying on you. Disordered thought processes they mainly belong in the disordered thinking group, but generally just bizarre behaviors, expressing things that other people just don't really have. Negative symptoms are things that are missing, or they're sort of under expressed in people with schizophrenia, like social withdrawal. So you see a decrease in social activity, really an unwillingness to get into social situations. A blunted emotional response that we call flattened affect, and a decrease in ability to take pleasure in things they once did. That's called anhedonia. It's similar to depression, but coupled with these other things, with the positive symptoms, that's a negative symptom of schizophrenia. Just overall, a decrease in motivation or ability to care for oneself or focus on tasks, a decrease in moving around, they call that catatonia, reduced movement, and a decrease in speech output, so using the minimum number of words to express something, we call that alogia. All right, so these are the symptoms of schizophrenia. There's a number of different hypotheses. We're going to talk about a couple of the transmitter-based hypotheses of schizophrenia and some new genetic evidence that supports at least one of these hypotheses. The first hypothesis is the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. And two pieces of evidence that support this are, one, if you block dopamine receptors in this frontal pathway of the dopamine systems, that's the mesolimbocortical pathway. If you block dopamine receptors with drugs, you decrease the positive symptoms. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to block that dopamine system without also blocking the nigrostriatal system just posterior to that. Blocking those dopamine receptors produce the side effects like tardive dyskinesia. We call there's extrapyramidal side effects like tremor and seizures can occur. Akathisia, not being able to sit still, they sort of have to get up and be moving around all the time. And there are drugs that block dopamine receptors that decrease positive symptoms very efficiently. Those older drugs like thorazine, which is the trade name of chlorpromazine. There are other phenothiazine drugs that block dopamine receptors. There's newer antipsychotic drugs that do the same thing. We call these atypical antipsychotics. Antipsychotics also used to be called neuroleptics, and these atypical sort of second generation ones are called clozapine, risperidone, codeapine, and you probably recognize some of these names. They're being used now as adjunct therapy to treat depression. Maybe a little bit controversial. Anyway, these atypical antipsychotics were supposed to have fewer or less severe side effects and greater effect on negative symptoms, probably because they interact with the serotonin system as well. They block this subtype of dopamine receptor, the D4 receptor, more efficiently than they block the dopamine D2 receptor. If we go back to the pathway, that D4 receptor is the one that's expressed more in the mesolimbocortical pathway, and the D2 receptor is expressed more in the mesostriatal pathway. So you're supposed to have fewer motor side effects. People's negative symptoms do respond a little bit to these drugs, but it turns out that over the long term, these newer drugs just don't produce the long-term outcomes that are any better than the first generation antipsychotics. Side effects might be better, and the negative symptoms may respond a little bit, but they weren't as good as we were expecting them to be. So that's kind of sad. So dopamine blocking agents improve positive symptoms. That's piece of evidence number one supporting dopamine. Other piece of evidence is that dopamine receptor agonists, right? Like what are the dopamine receptor agonists you guys know about? Cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine. These are drugs that ramp up activity in the dopamine system. And in people with schizophrenia, they can precipitate positive symptoms. So if you give somebody with schizophrenia amphetamines, that can, bring on these symptoms like the delusions and hallucinations. In people without schizophrenia, if at a high enough dose, you can induce positive symptoms. If you give somebody enough methamphetamine, they can get paranoid, they can get delusions of grandeur, and some of these other positive symptoms that you see. But not negative symptoms. You give somebody a lot of cocaine and you don't get social withdrawal. If anything, you increase their sociability, and so it's not the best model for schizophrenia. There's another model that's better, and that's the glutamate model. So the glutamate hypothesis of schizophrenia, here's some evidence to support that. First of all, glutamate receptor blocking agents or antagonists like phencyclidine, which is PCP or angel dust, and ketamine, which is sold on the street as Special K. It's a veterinary anesthetic. They block the NMDA type glutamate receptors and can induce symptoms like the ones you see in schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations, delusions of grandeur, delusions of persecution, but you can also get negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Even in people without schizophrenia, you get that social withdrawal, a decreased motor output, a decreased number of words that they use. So you get disordered thinking as well. So this is, I think, a better model for schizophrenia. because the dopamine agonists, remember, only produce those positive symptoms. Here's some more evidence. There's an underactivity in the frontal lobes that you see in schizophrenia. There's a couple of sort of simple tests that you can do to challenge the frontal lobes. One of them is the Wisconsin card sorting test. And when you use ketamine and PCP, you have trouble with this test just like people with schizophrenia do. There's hippocampal overactivity. It's overactivity in the hippocampus. There are other cognitive impairments that you can induce with ketamine and PCP that resemble what you see in schizophrenia. Interestingly, when you do this in an animal model, when you give ketamine or PCP and measure dopamine activity in that mesolimbocortical pathway, it's overactive. It's like the dopamine system is compensating for the reduced glutamate activity because the glutamate receptors are being blocked by the drugs. Long-term treatment decreases prefrontal dopamine activity, like you see in people with schizophrenia. You actually have underactivity of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. And finally, there's a mouse model where they've knocked out a receptor subunit, a protein. They've knocked down the gene that codes for this protein. And it's kind of tough to say whether the mouse has schizophrenia, but they are hyperactive. They do have social impairments, some sexual impairments as well. You can measure dopamine overactivity, and dopamine receptor antagonists rescue this behavior. Remember, these are mice that are missing one of the components of a particular type of glutamate receptor. So, some additional evidence. One more piece of evidence that supports the glutamate model. It comes from new gene studies. Now, one thing you should realize is that schizophrenia is probably the most heritable mental disorder. We can measure how heritable a disorder is by looking at what we call the concordance rate. The concordance rate is, you look at relatives and you see what percentage of different types of relatives also express the disorder given a single individual with schizophrenia. Now, if your monozygotic or identical twin is diagnosed with schizophrenia, then you have, at least a 50% chance of developing this. Well, some studies report that this concordance rate may be as high as 70 to 85%. It depends on how you count them. So that's more heritable than almost any disorder. It's not a perfect relationship, so we haven't identified like a single gene for schizophrenia. If it were just one gene, then of course the concordance rate would be 100% in monozygotic or identical twins. In fact, we've used this gene chip or microarray technology to examine the expression of genes in brains of people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia and compare that gene expression with that from non-schizophrenic people. And we've identified over 175 genes that are either overexpressed or underexpressed in people with schizophrenia. Now, I've selected 5 or 6 of them that support the glutamate hypothesis. There are many, many genes that have nothing to do with glutamate that are expressed in a strange way or incorrectly in people with schizophrenia, but here's just a few of them. And you don't need to memorize these, but just to show you some new evidence that supports this glutamate model. All of these genes code for proteins that are involved in glutamate signaling. So I'll just point out a few. So dysbendin is involved in packaging glutamate into vesicles. NRG1 is involved in the glutamate receipt of the message with the glutamate receptors. RGS4 is involved in another glutamate receptor type. G72 and DAAO are involved in the interaction of glial cells and the glutamate receptor, and it's all involved in glutamate signaling. So you'll see that the latest drugs that are being developed to treat schizophrenia act on this glutamate system. So this is sort of the next level, and we'll see some of those drugs being tested in clinical trials very soon. So dopamine hypothesis, maybe not as good as the glutamate hypothesis. and some genetic studies that support this latter model for schizophrenia. All right, we'll see you next time.